Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today, we're going to talk about one of the most misunderstood but strategically important issues in modern warfare. Why the Crimea Corridor was always Russia's weak spot. For years, Russia has portrayed Crimea as a fortress, a symbol of its return to great power status and the crown jewel of its southern front. But beneath the surface, the geography, logistics, and politics of the region reveal a fundamental vulnerability that has never gone away. What appears to be a stronghold is actually a trap built on fragile lines of supply, contested terrain, and constant exposure to attack. To understand why, we first need to remember what the Crimea Corridor really is. When Russia annexed Crimea in 2014, it created a new reality, but not a natural one. Crimea is a peninsula connected to mainland Ukraine by a narrow strip of land called the Isthmus of Perekop, only about 5 to 7 kilometers wide. That means Crimea is geographically isolated. After annexation, Russia's only direct connection to it was through the Kerch Strait, a gap of water between the Taman Peninsula in Russia and Crimea itself. Moscow spent billions building the Kerch Bridge to connect the two, opening it in 2018. It was meant to symbolize permanence, but it also revealed the problem. Without that bridge or a secure land route through southern Ukraine, Crimea was always dependent on fragile connections. When Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, one of its key strategic goals was to seize that land bridge, the territory stretching from the Russian border through Mariupol, Melitopol, and toward Crimea. That's the corridor we're talking about, a strip of land along the Sea of Azov that connects Russian territory to Crimea through occupied Ukraine. In theory, it was supposed to solve Russia's logistical nightmare. In practice, it turned into another weak point. The first and most basic reason for that weakness is geography. The corridor runs through open, flat terrain with very few natural barriers. This means it's easy to attack and hard to defend. It's crisscrossed by rivers, small towns, and roads that can be easily targeted by artillery, drones, or sabotage operations. Unlike mountainous or forested regions, there's no place to hide large logistics convoys. The line of communication is long, exposed, and vulnerable to precision strikes. For any army, especially one facing modern long-range weapons, this is a nightmare. Next comes logistics. Every army runs on fuel, ammunition, food, and spare parts. The longer your supply chain, the more opportunities there are for disruption. The corridor is narrow, only a few dozen kilometers wide in many places, and every major supply line runs along a few key routes, mainly the E105 highway and a single railway that passes through Melitopol and Dzhankoy before entering Crimea. If any part of that line is cut, the entire supply chain breaks. During the war, Ukraine has repeatedly targeted these routes with precision strikes, HIMARS systems, and drones, forcing Russia to spend enormous effort repairing and defending them. Even when the corridor is intact, its capacity is limited. The rail lines can handle only so many trains per day, and the roads can quickly become clogged with military and civilian traffic. When the Kerch Bridge was damaged by explosions in 2022 and again in 2023, the problem grew worse. Russia had to reroute supplies through the corridor, overburdening the limited infrastructure. Convoys stretched for kilometers, waiting to cross damaged bridges or move through mined areas. Each bottleneck became an easy target for Ukrainian strikes. The second explosion on the Kerch Bridge, in particular, showed how fragile the connection truly was. The attack didn't just destroy a few spans of the bridge. It shattered the illusion of security. For the Russian military, every supply delay had a ripple effect on the front lines. Units stationed in southern Ukraine and Crimea began running short on ammunition and fuel. Repairing the bridge took months and consumed vast resources, while Ukraine continued hitting supply depots and railway hubs in the occupied territories. Another weakness lies in the very nature of Crimea itself. The peninsula is heavily militarized, hosting Russian naval bases, airfields, and command centers. But militarization doesn't make it secure. In fact, it makes it more dependent on external supplies. Every aircraft that takes off from Crimea burns fuel that has to be shipped in. Every missile launcher there needs resupply. Every soldier stationed there depends on food and water, transported from the mainland. Crimea produces little of its own resources. And since Ukraine cut off the North Crimean Canal in 2014, even water supply became an issue. When Russia reopened that canal after invading southern Ukraine, it restored water flow, but only by occupying more territory, deepening its dependence on a vulnerable corridor. The geography also traps Russia strategically. A peninsula is easy to surround. If Ukraine can cut the land corridor and disable the Kerch Bridge again, Crimea becomes an isolated island. That isolation would force Russia to supply its troops only by sea or air, both of which are risky. The Black Sea Fleet has already suffered heavy losses, with multiple ships destroyed or damaged by Ukrainian drones and missiles. Air resupply would be limited, expensive, and vulnerable to interception. In military terms, that's called an untenable position, a place that cannot be held if your supply lines are cut. Another major issue is political and psychological. Russia annexed Crimea not just for strategic reasons but for prestige. It was supposed to demonstrate Russia's strength and the weakness of the West. The Kerch Bridge was built as a monument to that idea. But when that symbol of power can be struck, damaged, and rendered useless, it turns from a source of pride into a constant reminder of vulnerability. Every time Ukraine hits the bridge or a depot in Crimea, it shows that Russian control isn't as solid as Moscow claims. That damages morale, both among troops and among the Russian public. From a military perspective, defending the corridor drains resources. Russia has to protect every kilometer of it, stretching from the Donbas to the Isthmus of Perekop. That means thousands of troops stationed just to guard logistics, air defense batteries deployed to cover roads, and constant patrols to deter sabotage. Each unit assigned to protection is one less unit available for offensive operations elsewhere. Ukraine doesn't need to capture Crimea immediately to hurt Russia. It just needs to keep the corridor under threat. That constant pressure forces Russia to commit men and equipment to defense instead of attack. In addition, the corridor passes through territories where resistance remains active. Ukrainian partisans and local informants continue to disrupt supply operations, share targeting data, and conduct sabotage. Railways have been blown up, fuel depots set on fire, and checkpoints ambushed. These attacks don't always make headlines, but collectively they degrade the reliability of Russia's supply lines. They create uncertainty. When every train might be sabotaged and every depot could be hit by drones, logistical planning becomes guesswork. Let's also talk about the limitations of Russian infrastructure. Many of the roads and railways in southern Ukraine weren't built for heavy military use. Before the war, these were agricultural regions with limited industrial transport capacity. Constant movement of tanks, trucks, and fuel convoys has destroyed roads and bridges faster than they can be repaired. With Western sanctions cutting off access to advanced materials and machinery, Russia struggles to maintain those lines. The longer the war continues, the more fragile the corridor becomes simply from wear and tear. Ukraine, meanwhile, has learned to use modern technology to exploit those weaknesses. Drones, long-range missiles, and satellite intelligence allow precise strikes deep behind the front lines. Unlike in past wars, where distance provided safety, no point in the corridor is beyond reach. Ukrainian forces have repeatedly hit Russian ammunition depots in Melitopol, Tokmak, and Dizh-Ankoy, all critical nodes in the supply chain. These strikes not only destroy supplies, but also force Russia to spread out storage and reroute deliveries, increasing transit times and costs. In addition to the physical vulnerabilities, there's also an economic one. Maintaining Crimea and the corridor costs billions of dollars every year. Russia has to subsidize the peninsula's economy, repair damaged infrastructure, and fund the military presence. That financial burden grows heavier as Ukraine continues to strike assets. For Moscow, Crimea is becoming what military historians call a prestige trap, something too valuable symbolically to abandon, yet too costly to maintain. Another subtle but crucial weakness comes from the Sea of Azov. When Russia declared the Sea of Azov its internal waters after seizing Mariupol, it effectively turned the area into a military zone. But that means every ship and port facility there becomes a target. Ukraine has used naval drones and missiles to attack Russian ports and shipping, further limiting Moscow's ability to move supplies safely along the coast. Even the ports that remain under Russian control are within range of Ukrainian attacks. There's also a demographic and administrative problem. The corridor runs through occupied regions where the local population largely opposes Russian rule. Managing those territories requires repression, surveillance, and constant counter-insurgency efforts. That further drains manpower. The more resources Russia devotes to occupation duties, the fewer it has for the front. Meanwhile, Ukrainian intelligence continues to receive information from locals, allowing precision strikes on high-altitude targets like fuel trains or command posts. As the war drags on, the corridor's weakness becomes even clearer. In modern warfare, logistics aren't just a background detail, they decide outcomes. Russia's problem is that it built its war plan around holding and supplying Crimea, assuming that the corridor could be secured quickly and cheaply. But the longer it has to defend that corridor, the more exposed it becomes. Every kilometer of road and every bridge must be guarded, every convoy protected. Ukraine only needs to hit a few key points to cause massive disruption. Consider how this plays into future strategy. Ukraine doesn't necessarily need to invade Crimea directly to liberate it. If it can destroy the Kerch Bridge permanently and cut the corridor near Melitopol or Tokmak, Russia's forces in Crimea would be effectively isolated. Without fuel and ammunition, their combat effectiveness would collapse over time. Even without a direct assault, that isolation could force a Russian withdrawal or at least render the peninsula useless as a launch base for attacks. The corridor's vulnerability also limits Russia's ability to use Crimea as a logistics hub for operations elsewhere. Every rocket launched from Crimea against Ukrainian cities depletes stockpiles that must be replenished through the same fragile routes. Each time those supplies are delayed or destroyed, the effectiveness of Russian strikes diminishes. Ukraine has turned this into a long-term strategy of attrition, not by overwhelming force, but by targeting the arteries that feed the Russian war machine. There's another layer: seasonal challenges. The southern Ukrainian terrain turns muddy in spring and autumn, a phenomenon known as Rasputitsa. During those periods, unpaved roads become impassable, trucks get stuck, and logistics grind to a halt. Even the best Maintained routes suffer from weather damage. For Russia, this means planning supply convoys around seasons, further complicating an already fragile operation. In addition to physical strain, the psychological impact of losing the image of control is enormous. Crimea was supposed to symbolize Russia's return as a great power. Instead, it's become a symbol of overreach. Each successful Ukrainian strike on the peninsula, from airfields to naval bases, undermines Russia's image of invulnerability. Soldiers stationed there reportedly live under constant threat of attack, knowing that even deep in Crimea they're not safe. That kind of tension affects morale and efficiency. It's also worth noting that the corridor's weakness ties directly into broader geopolitical isolation. Russia's allies cannot easily help secure it. Unlike in the Soviet era, Russia has no friendly buffer states in the region. It stands alone, facing a Ukraine backed by Western intelligence, precision weapons, and surveillance capabilities. Every new long-range missile Ukraine receives extends the zone of danger deeper into Russian occupied territory, making it even harder for Moscow to sustain its positions. From a purely strategic point of view, the Crimea Corridor violates a basic rule of military geography. Never rely on a single line of communication through contested territory. Russia's decision to build its occupation around that narrow connection ignored centuries of military lessons. History is full of examples where overextended supply lines led to defeat, from Napoleon's march on Moscow to the German advance on Stalingrad. Crimea may not be as far, but the principle is the same. If your lifeline can be cut, your fortress becomes a trap. In recent months, we've seen Ukraine intensify its focus on this vulnerability. Drone strikes on Crimea's airbases, sabotage of railway lines, and attacks on the Kerch Bridge are all part of a coherent strategy. Make Crimea unsustainable. Even without massive territorial gains, each successful strike brings Russia closer to a logistical crisis. Analysts describe this as the slow strangulation strategy. Over time, the cumulative effect may force Russia to reconsider its entire posture in the south. Ultimately, the Crimea Corridor was never a strength. It was a patch, an artificial fix for a geographic reality that cannot be changed. Crimea, isolated by nature and dependent on external lifelines, can never be fully secure under conditions of war. Russia's insistence on holding it only deepens its vulnerability. The corridor was supposed to guarantee control. Instead, it exposes the limits of that control every day. For Ukraine, that weakness is an opportunity, not just militarily but symbolically. Each hit on the corridor, each explosion on the bridge, each disrupted supply line is proof that occupation isn't permanent. It shows that no matter how much Russia builds or how loudly it declares ownership, geography and logistics have the final say. And so, when we look back on this conflict, the Crimea Corridor may well be remembered not as a bridge to permanence, but as the path that led to overextension and eventual retreat. It represents a broader lesson about power and geography, that no empire, no matter how strong, can escape the limits imposed by terrain, supply, and resistance. Russia's weak spot was not hidden. It was built into its very strategy. Thanks for watching, everyone. If you found this breakdown insightful, make sure to like the video, share it with others who follow the war, and subscribe for more in-depth analyses. The story of the Crimea Corridor is still unfolding, but one thing is certain. Its weakness will continue to shape the outcome of the conflict for years to come.